They call me Charles Lee Locod, a nobody who traded a fiancé for a rifle, a home for a shack, and 3 years of his life for the lives of others. Joined the U.S. Army in '67. Some kill to live, and I was one of them. Never actually took a life, though, or at least I tried not to. But then there were those who lived to kill, like Sergeant Stevens, a hulking brute of a man from the backwoods of Carolina. He found pleasure in the most gruesome acts of violence. Last I saw of him was a few days ago, waving me off as I boarded the chopper. Good riddance. After what felt like an eternity wading through the muck and mire of the battlefield, I was finally heading home. One of the lucky ones, unlike so many of my brothers in arms who fell in that God-forsaken land. Getting away from Stevens was the thing that brought me the most joy. The man was a psychopath, a cold-blooded killing machine who took lives without a second thought. I remember him telling me when we first met, "Kid, I'm 23 kills in, and the only damn thing I feel is the kickback from this here rifle." A goddamn psychopath. But even 2 years steeped in such atrocities will eventually lead to a reckoning with one's own conscience. 3 weeks before I left Nam, he confessed he wished he was more like me. Wished he could take back the things he'd done. Wished he could turn back time and prevent himself from going down the road he'd taken. I consoled him. "Listen, Stevens, I know you hate yourself right now, but there's still time to change your path," or something to that effect. It was right before I got ordered to clear out a tunnel. All I remember is a loud boom, and Stevens dragging me out with tears in his eyes. After I was discharged from the base, I found myself at the bus depot in Tenino. Had to catch a connection back home to New York. Why didn't I just hop on a plane straight to New York, you ask? Don't ask me. Ask the government. They told me my bus would be a few hours late. Having not eaten anything besides stale crackers since Nam, I wandered across the street to a small diner. Ordered myself a large steak and eggs, sunny side up. The waitress jotted down my order, then gave me a strange look. "You want a different booth, hon?" she asked. I guess I was a bit fidgety. The feeling of my combat knife digging into my thigh wasn't the most pleasant. After I finished my meal, the waitress came back with a bottle of Coca-Cola. "Here you go, hon, on the house," she said. An image flashed through my mind of an impoverished village we passed in Nam, somewhere along the Perfume River. A young girl ran up to me, smiled, and offered me a Coke. She said something in her native tongue, then ran off. As I twisted the cap off to take a sip, Stevens snatched the bottle from my hand and hurled it against a nearby rock. Shards of glass flew into the air, Coke splattering across the dusty road. "What'd you do that for?" I asked. Stevens replied, "Buddy, I've seen this one before. They put shards of glass in these here bottles. One sip and your insides will be ripped to shreds." He raised his rifle, pointed it at the young girl, clicked off the safety, and squeezed the trigger. What happened next was pure carnage. Lieutenant Higgins screamed, "Stevens, are you insane?" The mother ran over to cradle her fallen daughter, tears mixing with blood on the girl's lifeless face. Stevens raised his rifle again, this time aiming at the grieving mother. I snapped out of it. The waitress was looking at me with a puzzled look on her face. "No, thank you," I said hastily. She motioned for me to take the bottle anyway. "Damn it," I said, "I don't want the goddamn Coke," I shouted. She quietly walked off, her face a mixture of confusion and sadness. After that debacle, I paid my bill, leaving the poor waitress a hefty tip, then walked back to the bus depot. It wasn't more than 30 minutes later that my bus arrived. I stepped onto the bus. The salt and pepper-haired driver glanced at my olive green army jacket and gave me a nod. "Welcome home, son," he said in a thick southern drawl. I took the last seat in the back, tossed my duffel bag on the seat in front of me, leaned back, and hoped to get at least a few minutes of shut-eye. No sooner had I leaned back in my seat than the bus lurched forward. I took a deep breath, let my muscles relax, and slowly drifted off. A horrific nightmare overtook me. I was back in the jungle. Stevens and I were taking turns on watch duty. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it. "Nice lighter, let me get a look at that," I said. He tossed it to me. I held it under the dim lamplight to get a better look. The inscription was barely legible, but I made out the words, "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for I am the baddest motherfucker in the valley." I chuckled. Fear no evil? What the hell does that even mean? Stevens took a drag from his cigarette and asked, "You ever read the Bible?" I shook my head. "There's this verse in the Bible that says those who believe in God shouldn't fear death because he is always with them." I changed it up a bit, T.A. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for I am the baddest motherfucker in the valley." Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? He looked at me inquisitively. "You buying any of this?" He took another drag and replied, "I like to tell myself that when I'm out there, gives me courage." From below the watchtower, I could hear Higgins yell up softly, "Stevens? Shut the hell up. You want to bring every damn Viet Cong out here?" Stevens shrugged it off, readjusting himself on the M60 as if he were busy. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "What was that, Stevens?" Higgins bellowed. "Jungle's too damn loud," Stevens replied. Higgins got even angrier. "Stevens, I saw what you did to that little girl. You're going down when I report this to the colonel." Stevens' teeth gritted. "You're going down if you breathe a word of this, Higgins." After a half hour of uneventful silence, a barrage of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Stevens immediately returned fire with a deafening roar from the M60. I took cover behind the sandbags, calling out targets. 2 o'clock, 11 o'clock, half a dozen of them. Stevens yelled, "Reload, reload." I grabbed a fresh belt of ammunition and fed it into the gun. From a distance, I could hear the rumble and screech of tank treads. A lone tank from our company was speeding towards the gate at full speed. 2 plumes of thick black smoke shot up from the tree line, heading directly for the tank. 2 loud explosions rang out, turning the tank into a giant ball of fire. "Hot! Hot!" Stevens yelled to me. I slipped on a pair of asbestos gloves and swapped out the barrel for him. "Link them all together," he roared. I struggled to link the ammunition belts together as fast as I could while taking cover behind the sandbags. "What the hell is going on?" Then I heard the sound of what seemed like 1,000 people yelling at once. Looking up, I was horrified to see an entire battalion of Viet Cong charging towards us, firing their weapons wildly. Stevens waited patiently for me to finish, muttered, "Fear no evil," then unleashed a continuous stream of lead from the machine gun. I grabbed my rifle and fired off a few rounds in their direction. Spent shell casings littered the floor of the watchtower. Calling out targets became pointless. They were coming at us from every direction. As I was reloading, I saw the barrel of Stevens' machine gun glowing red. That's when the last of his ammo ran out. He grabbed me and threw me off the watchtower. He jumped down, landing right beside me. Before I knew what was happening, he picked me up and started running. Looking back, I saw the Viet Cong overrunning the gate. Stevens and I ran for our lives into the jungle. Ahead of us, Higgins was running for dear life. Stevens raised his rifle and fired a single shot. I jolted awake, screaming at the top of my lungs, causing the driver to swerve the bus. The tires skidded across the rain-soaked road, sending the bus careening off the road and into a ditch. The bus slammed into a tree. I was thrown into the air, landing on the seat in front of me. I lay there motionless for a moment, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over me for what I had just done. I could hear the bus driver asking from the front, "You all right back there, son?" I sat up, replying, "Yeah, I've had worse." The bus driver nodded, then tried backing the bus up. The tires spun in place, only succeeding in kicking up mud and filling the wheel well. The bus driver stopped, stepped off the bus. I watched as he used his flashlight to survey the situation. I noticed a pitch-black figure standing in the mud in front of the flashlight. I didn't think much of it at first. Then I realized shadows are supposed to be behind light, not in front of it. I banged on the window to get his attention. He turned and looked at me, then shook his head. The shadow was still there when he turned to walk back towards the bus door. I took a closer look. The shadow remained motionless in the darkness, staring directly at me. Unbeknownst to me, the bus driver had made his way back to where I was sitting, while I was staring out the window in terror. "I'm gonna have to walk to the next town and call for a tow truck. We ain't getting out of here without one. Wheels are buried in a good 3 feet of mud." I snapped back to reality, frantically saying, "No, please don't leave me here with them." "With who?" "The shadow people. Can't you see them?" The bus driver cocked his head to the side with a confused look on his face. "Son, I think a trip to the psychiatrist is in order when you get back to New York. Ain't nothing out there but rain. Please just let me come with you." "Can't do that, company policy. You gotta stay put." "Please." "No can do. Just stay put and get some sleep. I don't want you screaming again when I get this thing moving." The bus driver turned and walked away. I pleaded with him to stay as he stepped off the bus, but to no avail. He paused for a moment once he was engulfed in darkness. I was hoping he would change his mind, but he didn't. All he did was reach back into the bus and pull the keys from the ignition. The bus was now cloaked in darkness. As he walked away, he said, "Son, I really don't want to leave you stranded out here like this, but I got no other choice. Only advice I can give you is, don't be afraid of the dark." I slumped down in my seat, trembling with fear. I finally convinced myself that I was going crazy. It made perfect sense. I had been through a war. Of course my mind would be affected. The shadow didn't attack the bus driver, so it had to be all in my head. I muttered to myself, "Don't be afraid of the dark." It gave me a small bit of courage. For all I knew, I was just a crazy person stranded in the woods. I stared back out the window, watching the rain come down in sheets. Rain has a strange effect on people. For some, it depresses them. Others enjoy watching and listening to it. For me, it made me have to pee. I didn't want to go outside because I was still afraid of those damn hallucinations. But nature was calling. I cautiously stepped off the bus, finding a nearby tree to relieve myself on. As I was finishing up, I heard it, a noise. It sounded like boots squishing in the mud. I told myself, "Just your imagination. You're going crazy. Don't be afraid of the dark." I zipped up my pants, scanning my surroundings. Off in the distance, I could see something moving in the trees. It looked like a group of dark figures. A twig snapped. I immediately looked to my right and saw a dark figure charging at me. I forgot all about everything, running full speed towards the bus, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it. I ran to the back of the bus, crawling under the last row of seats. The sound of the rain pounding on the roof of the bus was drowned out by the sound of heavy footsteps outside. The worst part was not knowing if they were still there, or if they had moved on. I whispered, "Just a hallucination. Don't be afraid of the dark." I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to fall asleep. I would rather have a war nightmare than face whatever was out there. A faint scratching sound could be heard on the side of the bus. It came and went for about an hour. Then it turned into a high-pitched screeching sound, like fingernails on a chalkboard, sending chills down my spine. Then came the loud banging sounds, as if hands or branches were being slammed against the side of the bus. I cowered in fear, clutching my knees to my chest as the bus began to rock violently from side to side. I thought I was dreaming. I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands, trying to wake myself up. I squeezed harder and harder until I could feel the blood dripping down my hands. That's when I realized I wasn't dreaming. High-pitched screams could be heard. They sounded identical to the screams from that night, when Stevens and I were overrun at the watchtower. I muttered to myself, "Don't be afraid of the dark. Don't be afraid of the dark. Don't be afraid of the dark." It gave me a small amount of courage, but quickly faded when I heard the sound of shattering glass and hurried footsteps rushing into the bus. As I looked up, I saw the feet moving towards me. I closed my eyes tightly shut, yelling in vain, "Don't be afraid of the dark. Don't be afraid of the dark. Don't be afraid of the dark." I opened my eyes. The footsteps were gone. I took a deep breath. Maybe my mantra had worked. Then I heard an eerie sound. It sounded like bare, wet feet padding across hardwood floors. 2 small, bare, blood-soaked feet were slowly approaching me. My heart raced faster with each heavy thud as they inched closer and closer. I felt like my heart was going to explode as the feet came to a stop, just inches from my face. I whispered, "Don't be afraid of the dark." One more time, but the apparition didn't go away. It bent down, reaching its clenched fist under the seat. I pressed myself against the wall of the bus. The blood-soaked fist moved right in front of my face and stopped. Slowly, the tiny fingers began to unfurl. It wiggled its fingers as if wanting me to grab a hold. I shuddered, uttering, "No." Then I heard a familiar voice say, "If you're not afraid of the dark, take my hand." I hesitantly reached out and grabbed a hold. The small hand gently pulled me out from under the seat. As I stood up, I looked down at the hand I was clutching. It was the little girl, the one Stevens murdered. Blood trickled from a head wound and covered her entire body. She looked up at me with a sympathetic look in her eyes, leading me down the aisle. As the little girl turned her head to look forward, I glanced up and was horrified to see the aisle filled with feet, standing shoulder to shoulder. They had been here the entire time. My mantra was useless. Most of them were the blood-soaked faces of Viet Cong soldiers, staring directly at me. Some had blank expressions. Some were sad. A few bowed their heads in prayer. And then there were the ones who looked at me with pure hatred in their eyes. Their gazes followed me as the little girl and I walked towards the front of the bus. My jaw dropped in disbelief as I saw Higgins staring directly at me. His jaw was missing. Then to my utter horror, I saw me. I was standing at the front of the bus. Most of my face was blown off. The man who looked exactly like me motioned with his hand, pointing at the driver's seat, signaling me to sit down. I took a deep breath, shakily asking, "Who are you people?" The man who looked exactly like me mimicked me, taking a deep breath, then replied, "They were fathers, sons, brothers, mothers, daughters, sisters. The only thing they wanted in their final moments of life was to go home. to be with their families. You took that right away from them. You got the wrong guy. I've never killed anyone. Do you recognize any of them? After taking one more look around the bus, I looked back at myself, replying, yeah, a few, like this little girl. The older woman back there is her mother, and the guy with no jaw is Higgins. The man who looked exactly like me pressed his lips together, asking, what happened to them? Stevens killed them all. Where's Stevens? He's still in Vietnam. Are you sure? Positive. He was the last person I saw before I got on that chopper. The man who looked exactly like me pointed at the driver's seat once again, demanding that I sit down. I shakily sat down, placing my trembling hands on my lap. He reached out in front of me, adjusting the rear-view mirror. Then he asked, what do you see? I don't see anything. Get your lighter out. I don't have a lighter. I don't smoke. Yes, you do. Right breast pocket. I reached up to my chest, feeling something hard and rectangular in my pocket. I reached in, pulled it out, then froze. Well, what are you waiting for? Light it, he demanded. I whimpered. No, I don't want to. He growled. Don't be afraid of the dark. Do it. The lighter flicked open, making a distinct clinking sound. I spun the wheel. The small flame flickered to life. I was horrified as I looked in the mirror. Staring back at me was Stevens. How is this possible? Locod placed his hand on my shoulder, saying, a month ago, you told me that you envied me, that you wished you could change your ways and become a better man. No, I don't believe it. You've been lying to yourself, believing that you're someone that you're not. No, I'm Charles Lee Locod. Private Charles Lee Locod died when his sergeant ordered him to clear out a tunnel. He stepped on a tripwire. The grenade detonated, taking most of his face with it. I'm Charles Lee Locod. I'm from New York. I'm going home to my fiancée. He gripped my shoulders, asking forcefully, what does she look like? I remained silent, trying to recall the image of the woman I loved, but nothing came to mind. After what seemed like an eternity of silence, he said, you can't remember, can you? I shouted. No, I just can't picture her. It's been over a year since I've seen her. A fist collided with my face. You can't remember because there's nothing to remember, he roared, his blood-soaked face just inches from mine. I felt someone reach into my shirt pocket. Looking over, I saw the little girl pulling something out. She opened her hand, revealing a set of gold teeth. Those aren't mine, I yelled. You're right, Stevens. They're not yours. You ripped them out of Higgins's mouth yourself. I don't understand what's going on. What do you people want from me? The man released his grip on me, taking a step back. You need to remember what you did. You can continue living a lie, believing that you're an innocent man named Charles Lee Locod, or face who you really are and change your ways. I am Locod, damn it. I'm just going crazy. He stared into my eyes, saying, read the inscription on your lighter. I shook my head. I don't want to. Read it. No, I won't read it. Face it, Stevens. Tears streamed down my face as dozens of hands were placed on my shoulders and back. The little girl wrapped her arms around me. At that moment, I finally remembered. I was the one who killed Higgins. I was the one who murdered that little girl. I was the one who got Locod killed. My name may have been Stevens, but there were two different people living inside of me. A murderer who was left behind in the depths of war, and a man who wanted to put his dark past behind him. I whispered, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for I am the baddest motherfucker in the valley. I didn't even need to look. I knew those words by heart. Night had fallen, the clock edging towards 8 p.m. It was November, and the darkness was a thick, velvety blanket smothering the world. The air wasn't cold, not exactly, but a creeping dampness clung to everything, carrying with it the scent of rotting leaves from the untamed gardens that plagued the campus grounds. I trudged down the sidewalk, my heart heavy in my chest. I loved the night, loved the way the stars looked against the black expanse. Not that I could see them here. The campus was on the edge of the city, the glow of streetlights obscuring any celestial beauty. A fat squirrel darted across the path, stopping mere inches from my feet. It stared up at me, chittering as if I had committed some grave offense. It didn't seem afraid, which irritated me. I stomped my foot, expecting it to flee. It didn't. It just lay there, unmoving. I had the unsettling feeling that if I reached down, I could pick it up. But I'd been at this school long enough to know that if I touched it, it would probably disappear. Vanish. Like it was never really there at all. So I continued on my way. I had things to do and couldn't afford to be delayed by anything. At the end of the path, tucked behind a cluster of trees, was the only women's restroom still open at this hour. The school tended to lock up early on Friday nights, so I considered myself lucky that there was still somewhere I could relieve myself, especially since I had an hour's drive ahead of me. The thought of having to stop at a gas station at this time of night sent shivers down my spine. Rounding the last building, I finally reached my destination. It was a small, solitary structure that looked more like a concrete outhouse than anything else. I wasn't an architect, but it was clear that this building was designed for one purpose, and one purpose only. A sudden gust of cold wind whipped past, making me spin around. The parking lot was deserted, shrouded in shadows, just a few feet away, surrounded by a field of flat, dead grass. The campus buildings themselves were dark, most classes long dismissed. Seeing no one, I exhaled, my grip on my keys loosening slightly. The door creaked open with a tortured groan as I pushed it, flakes of rust raining down onto the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the small, confined space. The floor was tiled, the walls painted a sterile white, illuminated by a single, flickering fluorescent light above the row of 6 stalls. There were only 2 sinks and a lone roll of toilet paper hanging precariously from the trash can. I bypassed them both, heading for the handicapped stall out of habit. I always felt a pang of guilt, using it when I knew it was designed for those who actually had difficulty using a regular stall. As a kid, I had loved the extra space, but now, not so much. Contrary to popular belief, women's restrooms were not more fragrant than men's. For whatever reason, they always seemed to smell worse, and I knew. In high school, I'd made a bet with some friends that I could use every men's restroom on campus. And I did, because I was an adventurous soul. But this was different. This was worse. Like something had died and was slowly decomposing inside the sanitary disposal unit mounted on the wall. Knowing what was routinely deposited in there, I decided not to investigate further and focused on the task at hand. As I finished up, I heard it. A low wheezing sound, like someone struggling to breathe, coming from the stall next to me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't resist taking a peek. I leaned forward, craning my neck until I could see under the stall divider, my gaze sweeping across the remaining 4 stalls. At first, I saw nothing. They were all empty. The sound must have been coming from the handicapped stall next to mine, but just as I was about to turn back, I noticed a pair of feet dangling from the last stall in the row. That's when I realized someone was standing on the toilet seat in the first stall, bare feet, so she must have been wearing a dress or shorts. Where were her shoes? I wasn't sure. No one just wandered around the city without shoes. At least I'd never seen that. Relieved to have found the source of the noise, I closed my eyes with a sigh, about to stand up and make my exit when something else happened. A head popped up from the last stall, clearly belonging to the same person with the dangling feet. But there was something about this girl that made me uneasy. She had a disheveled appearance with messy, dark hair. Her skin was an unnatural shade of white, as if she hadn't seen the sun in years. Her face was gaunt, with sharp, delicate features that were lost in the shadows. She looked too young to be in college, maybe high school. Her cheeks and eye sockets were strangely sunken. Her eyes were dark, like black marbles. I was 4 stalls down, making all sorts of judgments about this girl, when I realized she had caught me staring. Mortified, I quickly sat up straight, my face burning with shame. Should I apologize? Was that something people did in public restrooms? And what was up with her eyes? I tried to shake off the last question, telling myself it was just my imagination. Her eyes probably looked that way because I was so far away and couldn't get a good look at them. Surely they were hazel or something. I stood up, ready to make my escape from the stall and my embarrassment, when I heard another sound. Strange sound. It was a shuffling sound, like someone was dragging themselves under the stall divider. My back went cold as I registered the bizarreness of the situation. Why was she crawling under the stall divider? Was she autistic and lost? That would certainly explain her appearance. Maybe she'd wandered away from her caretaker and decided to play in the women's restroom. After all, it was never locked, even after hours. I decided I would call campus security and report her, just in case she was a missing person. I also didn't want to startle her, as she looked frail and pitiful, maybe even hungry. So I composed myself, sat back down, and leaned down to peek through the gap. My blood ran cold as I saw the girl staring back at me from the stall next door. I opened my mouth to ask her name, but stopped, horrified by what I saw. Her eyes were truly black, like charcoal. Her pale skin was cracked in places, as if it were dried out and devoid of all life. Her throat, which I hadn't noticed before, had a long gash in it, with something black and crusty clinging to the edges. I couldn't make out the rest of her, however, as only her head and neck protruded from under the divider. I couldn't be sure, but at that moment, I didn't want to see anymore. It wasn't human. Terror seized me as I scrambled back, my nerves on fire. My breath hitched in my throat, my heart pounding against my ribs. If I ran out of the restroom, I would have to run past it. I squeezed my eyes shut, the image of it lunging at me, claws outstretched, flashing through my mind. How could I get out of here? I didn't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear, when I heard another sound. This time it was a thump, like it was bumping lightly against the wall. My heart leaped into my throat. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was already finished. For a split second, I thought about making a run for it. It was my only chance, as there was no other way out. Then I realized something. The noise had stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear, trying to pinpoint the creature's location by sound, but it was no use. The wheezing had stopped, and I no longer heard the shuffling or the bumping against the floor and walls. Was it still in there? I knew I had to look. It was possible that it was standing right outside the exit, or worse, it could be right outside my stall. I had to make a decision, and fast. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek through the gap one last time. The left was clear. Holding my breath, I glanced towards the exit. Nothing. A wave of relief washed over me, only to be replaced by a jolt of fear as I heard a shuffling sound to my right. Before I could process what was happening, I whipped my head around, expecting to see it staring back at me, just inches from the stall I was hiding in. But it wasn't. It was just a pair of hiking boots. I froze, momentarily confused. Someone was in the handicapped stall. When did they get there? But who cared? Someone else was here with me. And even though I didn't know who it was, after my encounter with that thing, I was relieved to know I wasn't alone. But as usual, my relief was short-lived. I heard the wheezing sound again, this time coming from inside my stall. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I forced myself to look up. It was here. A wave of putrid air hit me, even worse than the stench from before. Its face was contorted in anger, its messy hair flying around its head, those black, beady eyes burning into me. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rotting teeth. And then, as I looked into the eyes of that monster, I was struck with a terrifying thought. It was hungry, and it wanted to eat me. That thought spurred me into action. I threw myself against the stall door, the flimsy lock snapping under the force. I wanted to run to my car, drive home, curl up in bed, and pretend this was all a bad dream. And I would have, if not for the girl I almost ran over on my way out. We nearly collided, but I managed to swerve out of the way just in time. This girl was dressed in a trendy cropped jacket, ripped jeans, and a white tank top. She gave me a strange look before entering the restroom. I should say something, maybe warn her about what was waiting inside. But as I stood there, listening again, straining to hear any unusual sounds, only silence met my ears. It was then that it all clicked into place. The person in the handicapped stall must have pulled their feet up when I walked in. They were probably recording, waiting for a scream. Or worse, they were filming me in the bathroom. And this girl was probably an actress, hired to scare the hell out of anyone who stumbled in here. What a sick prank. I spun around, hurrying towards my car, my phone already in my hand. I called campus security, reporting the pervert who had been filming me in the restroom. I knew filming someone in the bathroom, whether it was a prank or not, was illegal. They said they would look into it, and with that, I drove home. I wish I hadn't. The next day, when I arrived on campus, the school was on lockdown, police cars and officers swarming everywhere. A girl had been murdered in the women's restroom last night. The estimated time of death was 8:34 p.m. It was the same girl I had almost run over. Apparently, there had been a string of murders in the city. A man had been sighted at several of the crime scenes, always lurking around women's restrooms where the victims were found. He would hide in the handicapped stall until the girls went to the sinks. Then he would attack them from behind, slitting their throats. Whatever that thing was in the bathroom, it had saved my life. My childhood was a nomadic blur, a river rushing towards an unknown sea, never lingering too long in one place. We landed in Rhode Island when I was 8 and stayed put until I left for college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are steeped in the hazy, salty air of the ocean state, but somewhere in the shadowy recesses of my mind linger fragmented recollections of the houses we inhabited during my formative years. Most of these memories are fleeting and inconsequential, chasing after a neighborhood boy in the backyard of a North Carolina home, attempting to build a raft to float on the creek behind our Pennsylvania rental. One series of memories, however, remains as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. I often wonder if they were merely feverish dreams brought on by a prolonged illness that spring. But deep down, I know they were real. At the time, we were living just outside the town of New Vineyard, Maine, population 643. The house was sprawling for a family of 3. There were rooms I never even stepped foot in during the 5 months we lived there. It was, in a word, excessive for our needs, but it was the only house on the market at the time, or at least within an hour's drive of my father's new job. The day after my 5th birthday, a sparsely celebrated affair, I woke up with a fever. The doctor diagnosed me with infectious mononucleosis, which meant no roughhousing and at least another week bedridden. This was torture enough. We were in the process of packing for our move to Pennsylvania, and most of my toys were already boxed up, leaving my room a barren wasteland. My mother brought me ginger ale and books a few times a day, and they were my only solace for the next few weeks. Boredom hung like a specter at the edge of my awareness, waiting for a chance to consume me. I don't recall exactly when I met Mr. Weidmuth. It must have been about a week after I was diagnosed. My first memory of the small creature is asking his name, to which he replied, "You can call me Mr. Weidmuth." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. His mouth was enormous, a gaping maw that stretched impossibly wide across his face. It was filled with dozens of teeth, too many teeth, all of them needle-sharp. His eyes, too, were oversized and unsettlingly intelligent for a creature that looked like it had crawled out of a nightmare. "You look like a Furby," I said, as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Weidmuth paused and looked at me quizzically. "A Furby? What's a Furby?" he asked. I shrugged. "You know, it's a toy. Little robot things with big ears. You can pet them and feed them, almost like a real pet." "Oh." Mr. Weidmuth resumed his perusal of my book. "You don't need one of those. They're nothing like a real friend." I remember Mr. Weidmuth always disappeared whenever my mother came to check on me. "I crawl under your bed," he explained later. "I don't want your mommy and daddy to see me. I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore." We didn't do much in those first few days. Mr. Weidmuth mostly just looked through my books, expressing fascination with the stories and pictures. On the 3rd or 4th day after I met him, however, he greeted me with an uncharacteristically wide grin. "I have a new game we can play," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "We have to wait until your mom comes to check on you because she can't see us play this game. It's a secret." After my mom had brought in my daily ration of books and soda, Mr. Weidmuth crawled out from under my bed and tugged on my hand. "We have to go to the room at the end of the hall," he said. I protested at first, as my parents had forbidden me from leaving my bed without permission, but Mr. Weidmuth insisted. The room was bare, devoid of furniture or even wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a single window on the far wall. Mr. Weidmuth darted across the room and pushed the window open as far as it would go. Then he gestured for me to look down. We were on the 2nd story of the house, but the house was situated on a hill, and from this angle, the drop was more akin to 3 stories. I like to pretend things here, Mr. Weidmuth explained. I pretend there's a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you'll bounce right back up like a feather. I want you to try it. As a feverish 5-year-old, I could only muster a bit of skepticism as I looked down and considered the possibilities. It's a long way down, I said, but that's what makes it fun. It wouldn't be any fun if it was a short drop. You might as well jump on a real trampoline. I tried to picture myself plummeting through the air, then bouncing back up to the window on something only I could see. Common sense, however, won out. Maybe some other time, I said. I don't know if I can pretend hard enough. I might get hurt. Mr. Weidmuth's face contorted into an expression of pure rage, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. The anger was replaced by a look of disappointment. If you say so, he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, silent as a church mouse. The next morning, Mr. Weidmuth arrived carrying a small box. I want to teach you how to juggle, he said. These are some things you can practice with before I start teaching you with the real things. I looked into the box. It was full of knives. My parents will kill me, I shrieked, horrified that Mr. Weidmuth had brought knives into the house. Knives that my parents would never allow me to touch. I'll be grounded for a year. Mr. Weidmuth frowned. It's fun to juggle these. I want you to try. I pushed the box away. I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't for throwing. Mr. Weidmuth's frown deepened. He took the box of knives and retreated under the bed, where he stayed for the rest of the day. I started to wonder if he was always under my bed, even when I didn't know it. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Weidmuth would often wake me up in the dead of night, whispering that he had placed a real trampoline below the window, one so big and bouncy that I couldn't see it in the dark. I always refused and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Weidmuth was persistent. Sometimes he would stay by my side until dawn, encouraging me to jump. He was no longer a playful companion. He was something else entirely, something unsettling, something sinister. One morning, my mom came in and told me that I was free to roam outside. She figured the fresh air would do me good, especially after being cooped up for so long. I eagerly slipped on my sneakers and raced out the back door, desperate for the feel of the sun on my skin. Mr. Weidmuth was waiting for me. There's something I want to show you, he said. I must have given him a strange look, because he added, It's safe, I promise. I followed him to the head of a deer trail that snaked through the woods behind our house. This is an important path, he explained. I've had a lot of friends your age. When they're ready, I take them down this path to a special place. You're not ready yet, but someday I hope to take you there. I returned to the house, wondering what lay at the end of that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Weidmuth, the last of our belongings were loaded onto the moving truck. I would be riding in the cab of that truck, next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I had thought about telling Mr. Weidmuth that I was leaving, but even at 5 years old, I had begun to suspect that the creature's intentions were not entirely altruistic, despite his assurances. For that reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My dad was in the truck by 4 a.m. With the help of an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks, he was hoping to reach Pennsylvania by lunchtime the next day. He looked more like a man about to run a marathon than someone about to be confined to a driver's seat for 2 days straight. This early enough for you? Dad asked. I nodded and rested my head against the window, hoping to catch a few more minutes of sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "This is the last move, I promise. I know it's been hard on you, especially with you being sick. Once I get this promotion, we'll be able to settle down, and you can make some real friends." I opened my eyes as we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in the window of my bedroom. He stood motionless until the truck turned onto the main road. Then, he gave a small, hesitant wave goodbye, a butcher knife clutched in one hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The lot where our house once stood was empty, nothing but a concrete foundation, as the house had burned down a few years after we left. On a whim, I decided to follow the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Some childish part of me half expected him to leap out from behind a tree and scare me half to death. But I sensed that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tethered to the house that no longer stood. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that a disturbingly high number of the headstones belonged to children. And that's how I found myself standing in that graveyard, staring at rows of tiny headstones. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw him again, standing at the edge of the trees. Mr. Widemouth, still watching, still waiting. When I was 12 years old, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my family, was against me. I was never a bad kid, but my parents sure treated me like I was. For example, I had to be home by 5 p.m. every single day. This obviously put a damper on my after-school playtime. I wasn't allowed to have friends over, nor was I allowed to go over to anyone else's house. I had to do my homework immediately after getting home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games, and instead made me read books, and then write a report on them to prove that I actually read it. Now, while the rules listed above irritated me to no end as a child, they weren't what upset me the most. The thing that really got to me was the lack of empathy from my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty for any accidents or mistakes I made. My father only knew one emotion: disappointment. The only times he ever spoke to me were when he was scolding me for bad grades or beating me for misbehaving. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school psychologist. For his privacy, we'll call him Dr. Tanner. Like most middle schools, a psychologist was on campus during school hours to assist any student who needed counseling, whether it be emotional, academic, social, behavioral, etc. To be honest, I never saw any students speaking to Dr. Tanner. Every day, I'd walk past his office on the way to the cafeteria and peek through the little window on the door. He would always be in there by himself, doing some paperwork. I figured that most kids were too scared to talk about their problems with a grown man who was practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me a good 3 weeks to work up the courage to step foot inside his office. March 2nd, 1993, was the day I decided to pour out my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him look up, smile, and gesture for me to come in. So I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. For the next 30 minutes or so, I rambled on and on to Dr. Tanner about how my parents treated me poorly and how they didn't care about me. After a while, my voice began to tremble and I stopped speaking. The psychologist had patiently listened to my entire spiel with his arms crossed and head nodding. I was half expecting him to start talking about how everything I had just said wasn't true, and my parents loved me very much, and blah blah blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a smile on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best psychologist in the world. I promise we'll fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "We have our ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that in 1 month's time, your relationship with your parents will be better than ever. Forever and ever." After a pause, he continued, "I do need you to promise me one thing, though. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow, and you won't tell a soul that we spoke today. It'll be our little secret." I promised. The next day, I went back to see Dr. Tanner after school. It was about 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm greeting, he asked me to take a seat in the chair in front of his desk once again. As I sat down, I noticed Dr. Tanner close the blinds on the little window of the door. "There," he smiled. "Now we have all the privacy we need." We began talking about my hobbies and passions, my favorite subject in school, my least favorite teacher, and things of that nature. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soda. I happily accepted, as my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached into his mini fridge and fumbled around for a bit before setting 2 open sodas on the desk. We then continued talking about what was going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I blacked out from whatever drug Dr. Tanner had slipped into my drink. It took a minute or so for me to adjust to my blurry vision upon waking up, and when I did see clearly, I didn't know what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed and my mouth was covered with duct tape. I immediately started to panic, thrashing and yanking at the handcuffs, but gave up shortly after. My eyes widened in astonishment after taking a look around the room. Posters of superheroes were plastered all over the walls, and photographs of famous athletes were displayed on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and Super Nintendo, with stacks of game cartridges next to it. I didn't know what to think. I was in a room filled with items that most kids would kill to get their hands on. I probably would have cried tears of joy if I wasn't restrained to the bed frame. My stomach dropped as the door creaked open and Dr. Tanner walked in. He took a seat on the edge of the bed. "Now listen," he said. "Just remember that I am here to help you, and I will never hurt you, okay?" Dr. Tanner gently removed the duct tape from my mouth and then the handcuffs from my wrists. My first instinct was to start crying, but there was just something about Dr. Tanner that made me feel safe. He smiled at me. "You're going to be staying here for a little while," he continued, "and during this time, you are free to play with any of the toys in this room when I'm home. But when I'm out of the house, I'll have to cuff one of your hands back to the bed. You can still watch TV, but I want you to only watch the news channels when I'm gone." I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he had just given me. "Well then," Dr. Tanner exclaimed, patting my knee, "make yourself at home. I'll be back when it's time for dinner." He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and hit the power button on the TV before locking the door behind him. A few more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't kidding. All I had to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. At around 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room with 2 plates of mashed potatoes and fried chicken. I finally worked up the courage to ask him how much longer I would be in this room. "Well, about a month," he replied, "give or take a few weeks. I just have a few things I need to take care of." The next morning, I woke up to Dr. Tanner's hand softly shaking my shoulder. "Hey there, champ. You don't have to get up just yet if you don't want to, but I'm gonna have to put this back on," he whispered, fastening the cold steel cuff to my wrist. I looked up at him. He was dressed in a collared shirt and slacks, a blazer draped over his shoulder, and a briefcase by his side. He looked exactly the same as he always did when I saw him at school. Before leaving, he placed the TV remote next to me and told me to turn on the news. The first thing I saw when I turned on the TV was a breaking news segment. A very important-looking police officer stood at a podium, surrounded by people holding microphones. I happened to start watching in the middle of his speech. A statewide Amber Alert was issued earlier this morning. We have several investigators working to identify potential kidnappers, but there is not much evidence to go off of as of right now. Teachers reported the boy last seen around 4 or 5 in the afternoon yesterday. I began to feel nauseous as a picture of me flashed onto the screen. It was my school picture from the previous year. The captions below my photo displayed my name and age, my school, and my town. Above my picture were alternating captions. FBI initiates. Search for child in kidnapping. Suspect unknown and possibly on the run. The live footage continued, and 2 figures I soon recognized as my mother and father stepped up to the podium. They both looked incredibly red-eyed. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she took the microphone. I'd never even seen my mother get this emotional before, as she sobbed on live television, choking out phrases like, "Please give me my son back," and "I'm so sorry," and "Please come home to us." When my father took the microphone, I was almost expecting his demeanor to be cold, but he too had tears welling up in his eyes. He begged the world to return his son home safely, and then ultimately pleaded for my forgiveness. Daddy knows he hasn't been the best father, but I'll be damned if I don't get the chance to be better. Please just bring my boy back. I turned the power off right then and there. My emotions were all over the place, as I had never seen my father cry. I felt heartbroken that my parents were going through so much, but at the same time, I was relieved. I knew now how much my parents loved me. Close to 4 weeks passed by, and Dr. Tanner treated me with the utmost respect. He left me to my own devices in the mornings, cuffed to the bedpost, but in the afternoons, he'd return and have lunch and dinner with me, talk, and play games. I never knew Dr. Tanner was so good at Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning, as Dr. Tanner was waking me up before work, I noticed a grim look on his face. I also realized that it was about 3 hours earlier than he usually woke me up. "You need to watch the news today, kiddo. No exceptions. I want you to leave the TV on all day and pay close attention," he said with a straight face. Of course, I complied and watched as he left the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I had been watching. The headline, "Decapitated Body Found." 2 men in fancy suits stood side by side and began speaking. "We are very sorry to have to deliver such unfortunate news this morning regarding our missing child case from earlier this month." One man hung his head as the one who was speaking shuffled through some papers. He continued, "The body of a person was found in a duffel bag underneath the overpass. The body appears to be that of a young child, although there is not much left and largely burned to a crisp." The screen transitioned to an aerial view of the freeway, dozens of cop cars surrounding the bottom of an overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. Inside of the bag, police recovered a middle school ID card labeled as so-and-so. The screen displayed the very student ID card that I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was somewhat melted, but my picture and name were still intact. After the two men stepped down, the camera panned to my parents. They were seated in between reporters. My mother's face was contorted in agony, and my father's face was buried in his lap. I turned off the TV. Dr. Tanner came home extremely late that night. He rushed into the room, uncuffed me, and handed me a glass bottle of soda. He placed his hand on my shoulder and smiled. I kept my promise, didn't I? I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I need you to make one more promise to me, he whispered. He told me that I needed to drink all of the soda in the bottle. It would help me sleep well, and that from this day forward, I was never allowed to tell a soul that I had ever met him. I promised. I told you I was the best psychologist in the world, right? And he was right. I woke up late that night to find myself lying in the middle of the park, stars shining brightly in the night sky. I recognized this park. It wasn't too far from my school. About a mile away, I could see my house. The lights inside were off, but I could see my dad sitting on the front porch steps. I hesitantly called out to him. He slowly lifted his head, but upon seeing me, he jumped up and ran towards me with open arms, calling my name. My mother came rushing out of the house after him. Dr. Tanner was right. Everything did change with my family and me. My parents smiled a lot more and treated me with love and kindness. I couldn't have asked for a more perfect ending. From time to time, I'd see Dr. Tanner around campus, walking to and from his office. We rarely made eye contact, let alone spoke to each other, but sometimes he'd wink and smile at me. I'll always keep my promise to him and pretend as if I never met the man, but there will always be one question that will forever linger in my mind. Whose decapitated head did Dr. Tanner throw off the overpass? Thank you for listening to this chilling tale. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more stories that will send shivers down your spine.